Your customers are lying to you. Now, sometimes it's on purpose, and other times it's because they really just don't know what they want. In product management, customer research is a critical part of the process, but let's face it, sometimes doing it right can be a little mysterious. So today, we're going to hear from a leading expert in customer and market research and ethnography about how he pairs qualitative and quantitative research together to get to the truth about how and why customers behave the way they do. Holtzclaw is the dojo master and chief strategist for Liger Partners. He's been a recognized expert in market and customer research for nearly 20 years. He's the author of the book Laddering, Unlocking the Potential of Consumer Behavior, has a weekly column on Inc.com, and you may have also seen him in Forbes magazine, on ABC News, or CNN. If you're a product manager or are responsible for delivering products that radically improve the lives of your customers, then go ahead and subscribe to Product Coffee below. And if you want more of this great content, hit the like button to let us know we're on the right track. Now let's swing over to Eric and learn how he approaches customer research and how that's changing in the world of COVID-19. Eric, welcome. So why don't we get started by telling us how you got interested in ethnography to begin with?
So in 2002, we started User Insight, and that was primarily a usability company to begin with. So can people use the products that we've created? And what happened while we were there is the world dramatically changed, and it moved what you needed to look at from a product perspective to really start developing products and services that would work correctly. And so I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what changed, and we're going to talk about how do you learn what the user really wants, and how do you understand how to get into that ecosystem now that we've had another dramatic change that may or may not, it's a hopefully temporary change. I don't want to wear a mask the rest of my life, and I really would like to go back to a movie theater at some point. But it has been long enough at this point that we will see an impact to the behaviors of buyers, both B2B and B2C, that will change the way that they think about products, think about what their product features should have in them. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And when we think about product and also kind of marketing, there's this customer journey that customers follow. And as a product person, it's my favorite role within the company because you really need to understand everything as it relates to how the person becomes aware of your product, to when they actually start to onboard and start using the product, no matter what it is, to how the features get improved and those types of things over time. And so before 2008, the job of the product manager, the job of the person responsible was very simple because the buyer journey was relatively controlled. Even in the days of internet, it was really important that your homepage was a place that I knew where to go next. And we talked a lot about what's the next action and how do I get somebody through the funnel. If you're in a retail environment, walking someone into the front door, making sure they know how to go down the aisle, pick up a product, put it in a cart, and move up to the front, and check out. We thought a lot about flow. We thought a lot about where do things get placed and how do our customers, our buyers, the users of our products really understand how to use those products and what to do with them. And it was easier, easy, right? And then 2007 happened, and we always have these transitional periods, right? So there's 2001, which was the dot-bomb. 2007, people blame that on the financial markets. So we had all this, real estate bust, and everybody believes the world changed because of that real estate bust in 2007, 2008. But really what happened in 2008 is we got three pieces of disruptive technology. So we got social media. All of us that were not on Facebook were allowed to finally join and, stalk our children and things like that. We got ubiquitous internet, so internet everywhere, and we got smartphones. So the only thing I've ever stood in line for was an iPhone. So I stood in line for an iPhone. I brought my daughter with me so that way I could buy two of them. And so those three pieces of technology were introduced at the same time. We had this major disruption in the real estate and financial markets. And there's it gets hidden. So things like that get hidden. And that's kind of what we're seeing today. There's this overarching theme of COVID but there's some changes that are being made to the way that our customers and users of our products really think about what they're doing, how they're doing those things. We'll blame it on COVID from now on, but there's going to be some kind of dramatic undercurrents that we need to think about that, someone was mentioning earlier, IoT, like connected homes and some of these types of things. So what are those trends up underneath, and how do we know which one of those have impacted our customers and what it means? And so, the customer journey, and I have one presentation, which I couldn't find last night when I was putting this together, that shows that people don't follow that path as directly, and we don't have as much control over it as we used to. In fact, they enter and exit that path dramatically. So before it was connected, so you see these things are all connected. Now they're broken apart. And we noticed that the customer or the buyer or the user who's moving, and you can change these names out. So as a product manager, you care about acquisition to use to feature enhancement. At each one of those points, your customer, your intended user of your product is now dropping in and out, and you don't have a lot of control over how they're learning about what that product does, what new features, how they might bolt something else on and start using it in a way that you didn't expect. And so research is the way that we can get to understanding what those buyers or customers want next, what the product features are that they really value. The problem is that most of the time we think about some really bad techniques for understanding that information. So back before 2008, we built a 14,000 square foot lab, and we brought people in and put them behind cameras and watched them use the product, and it was very controlled, and we reset the machine after every time. After 2008, we moved primarily to an ethnography approach. So going into people's homes and understanding what they did or how it worked. In the B2B space, going into their offices. I talked earlier about the tractor study, bringing somebody into a lab and making them use a tractor versus being in the field with them using the tractor. Very different type of product information that comes back. And so it's very important to get within context of who your customer is and start to understand what they're doing and why that's important. So when you think about your website or your product, you can't think about it like a billboard in the desert. And I use this often for sort of marketing. People build something and then they're wondering why people don't come. It's because you haven't done all the things around it to make sure that it's very compelling to your customer and really solves the problem that you think that it solves. Back to my example of the shopping cart. One of the reasons that we knew that this change had happened dramatically is back in 2008, we were commissioned by a relatively large company that has some orange colors to look at why people were abandoning the shopping cart online. And so we did the study to find out, why are people abandoning the shopping cart online? The product people want to understand, like they put a lot of money and time into the shopping cart. And, it would be like walking into a store and seeing shopping carts all over and they're sort of abandoned. And you're like, why did people leave products in the shopping cart? They're not there any longer. We did a study, went out and talked to people about their concept of a shopping cart, and went on shop-alongs with them, to see how they were using the products both online and then also going into the store and where the difference was. And what we learned is that the concept of an online shopping cart is not what the customer really thought of it. They were using the shopping cart as a reminder. It was a place for them to place a product and to come back later and buy it at that point, or to compare it to a product somewhere else. So they were using the shopping cart product online very differently than the shopping cart product in the store. And we had to spend some time in context with them to understand what that meant. Like, why are you putting it there? What are you going to do with it later? So that's where you got to some of these reminders we see nowadays of you leaving something in your cart and it's about to expire, those types of things to kind of move that behavior along. So getting into kind of the ethnography of who the customer is and what they do starts to also understand why they're using products the way that they do and what those mean. So, and I talk about COVID happening. So what has happened with COVID is we don't have the same opportunity now to go into people's homes or to really understand how they're using products and services. And when you're doing ethnography or thinking about talking to your customers, there are things that you need to do to understand really what they're telling you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, of kind of where that fits and how that works within the customer research. I'm going to give you two examples. So the first is I'm going to ask you, so when people talk about ideal client or they talk about ideal customer, what are some of the types of things that you'll see within a company?
So vertical markets are an example, right?
Yeah.
As
So they'll tell
well
you
as,
vertical. Yeah.
right, awareness relative to what they're hearing and all the social media that they have access to, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So COVID, anything COVID related. I mean, we saw toilet paper, hand sanitizer,
Yeah.
now patio heaters, is
Patio
supplied to,
heaters. I need to
oh
run
my,
out and buy a patio heater. I didn't realize that was a thing. All right, good. Demographics potentially. So that, age, the ideal client or the ideal customer for this product or the ideal buyer is, within this type of company. It has this many employees. Start to tell us a lot of what. So, and I use this for presentations I do with Vistage CEO roundtables. And I love the answers I get from them because they're always like, well, our ideal customers between the ages of 40 and 60, they make $100,000 and they have, 2.5 cats and all, like they tell me all this what, right? Like, and that's how they've mostly broken this down. And I'm sure as product people, you've received those, I'm supposed to build a product for a person who makes this much money and they're a male, right? And so one of my favorite examples, and I love that I get to use it here because all of us are from the Atlanta market, or at least I think most of you are, is there are two little suburbs, and I've lived in both of them, here in Atlanta, Georgia. So there's one called East Cobb, and just down the street from it is Roswell. And they are literally 2 miles from each other, literally 2 miles from each other. What's interesting about the difference between East Cobb and Roswell, and if you look at the pictures that I'm using, East Cobb has a propensity to like things that are sort of, and I'm making general statements, but these are true general statements based on some research and demographic information or demographic stuff that we've looked at. They like known brands. So a Marlowe's does really well, or potentially a California Pizza Kitchen, though I think I heard the Pine Straw one is closing. So it's a brand that's known in East Cobb does well. And a kind of boutique restaurant, one that maybe has been started by a sole proprietor, typically has a little bit of a problem surviving in East Cobb. So East Cobb wants to kind of see this known national brand. And in Roswell, you typically have more of a, even if it's pretending, it's a, feeling of a local restaurant. The demographic makeup of those two markets is exactly the same. So if you think about, who the people are and the product that they're consuming as it relates to restaurants and stores, they should be the same. They are 2 miles from each other and they have the same demographic makeup. But within those two markets, if you open up a Marlowe's in downtown Roswell, it's not going to be a thing. But if you have a Marlowe's or an East Cobb, it does very well. And so we have to get underneath like what's really driving people to live in certain areas. What do they care about? What are the things that drive them to sort of make these decisions? It was interesting. We were doing this ethnography study back in the 2007, 2008 burst, and we went into a lady's home and we were talking about using reward points. So how do you use reward points for buying items and things? It was a financial study. And their house, you could tell they were like selling the furniture, but she had this really nice watch that she had bought with the reward points. And she was using the reward points as a way to satisfy her need to go buy things. So like she had this desire to purchase, right? So it's understanding kind of the reasons behind what people are doing and what really is driving their decisions versus just looking at the surface. And so as we start to think about that and start to look at like who these individuals are, I've got a couple of examples here of their personas and, getting to ethnography and really thinking about what those people are and what drives them. You want to get to the concept of a persona. And so this is one that I have from a social media family, which is in the book. So I talk about the social media family and who they are and what they care about. And you have groups of people who are primarily online. So Penny, who's here, and her name is Popular Penny, is primarily an online person. So when you want to get to her or build products and services for her, you need to make sure that all of those things live online. The way that she's going to get awareness, the way she's going to use the product or service is going to be there. If you contrast her to Eddie, Eddie is always in person. He still has a flip phone. You know, he's not going to be somebody who's going to pay attention to things on social media. So if I'm building products and features for him, I have to worry about the fact that he's probably not going to use a touchscreen, or he's not going to be interested in how it connects to my house, right? This is not a guy who's going to connect everything up to his house. So, and it's because he has concerns with technology. You know, he doesn't necessarily understand it or trust it. So like, how is it that you kind of get around that to make sure you're building a product or service that's going to work within that category? And then you have kind of these interesting people who live in the middle, like Cade, and Cade connects Eddie because he's dating Vicky. So these are the kind of connection points that may allow you to move a product from one group to the next. Another interesting one to look at is in the B2B space, because people think that personas are often just a B2C concept, but they also work in the B2B space. And this is one of my favorite presentations we use with our B2B customers. You have different types of companies that make decisions based on typically it may be the life of the company, but it's also a lot around the culture. So they're companies that make independent decisions. So they're early adopters, informed and confident. So they're going to be the person who makes a decision on something because they want to be an alpha tester or they want to try something out. For those people, you're going to use very different terminology, and they're going to also be okay with your product failing on them when you push it out for the first time. So they're the ones you send something to because they're going to, you know, forgive you for things being wrong. Then you have your group that's here in this extensive network and fast followers category. They want something that's been out for a while and they want to hear about it from other people. So, you know, they're not going to take a risk. In a B2B decision is a very dangerous decision, because if I make that decision and it's wrong, I can get fired and I lose my job. So B2B, even though you think of it as often being like very different, there's not personas, there totally is. And if you've ever worked for a company that didn't really feel like a good fit, it's because the persona of the company didn't match to who you were as a person. And then finally, you've got your reluctant to change category here in the back, which are people that kind of get drug along. So it's a company that you work for that's still on the older versions of software, and they only make the change because it's about to be retired, right? And then finally, you have your back group, which is like government. So they have to go through RFP or it's a franchise. So knowing who you're selling to within these categories, and really and truly, you only understand this when you start to talk to them in context. So what is it that how do they talk about their employees? How do they, what does their environment look like, right? Like when I go into these kind of companies and look at what they're doing, I know where they fit based on how the space is equipped. Were they ready in a COVID environment to move completely online? So some of these companies were planning to go online sometime down the future. And so they're going to fall in this kind of 3 or 4 category. Your 1s and 2s were much more ready to move people to work from home. In fact, they may have already been doing most of that, and they just had the office as a way to collaborate. So getting into that context and understanding who those people are is really important to making sure that you understand how they make those decisions. And so when we get into sort of thinking about who your ideal client is, there's a set of questions that we want to look at that are beyond just demographics and some kind of segmentation. So you want to find out where they hang out. What does their day look like? So are they very busy and your product is just, you know, another thing they have to keep up with and think about? Where do they get their information from? What are their challenges and frustrations? What are their goals and priorities? What is their preferred form of communication? What phrases and exact language do they use? What makes them happy and successful? What goals and motivations do they have personally? And why do they buy from you? Why do they buy or use your product? Why do they really buy from you? And it's typically not going to be some specific feature. It's going to be some kind of problem that you're solving, that you're thinking about, that kind of moves them along. And so my biggest point here is that you have to think about the fact that your customers all lie. All of them lie to you. And so if you're using a quant survey to try to get to an answer as to why someone's using your product, number one, you may not know how to craft the questions correctly unless you've done the qualitative piece. and it doesn't give you the opportunity to do the follow-up. The most important thing you can do in this sort of customer research space is you have to ask the question why. And you have to ask why 5 times. So I tell people they need that when you're building a product and you're talking to a customer about what that product's features or functions needs to have in it, you want to ask the question why 5 times like your 5-year-old used to, right? Like when you were a 5-year-old. Well, why? Well, why? Because if you can do that, you'll eventually get down to what the core reason is why the person is using your product or understands it. And you should also be observing other things in their environment that are impacting what they're telling you. So if they are, telling you that that they're really all put together, but you know that you get into their home. That's why I love to get into their homes. And things are messy, then they like to present themselves as all put together, but really and truly they're messy. And so most of the stuff works really well when you get to go into people's offices or their homes. But now we're in a COVID world and we're building products and we want to understand why our customers are using our products or what they want next in those features or functions. So I'm going to put it out to the audience. I've got a couple of ideas, but what are some ways that you've seen or think would work in order to get that same type of information from your customer about why they're really using your product or service?
I think in the calls that I've been on, work calls, just seeing people in their home offices, so those who've chosen not to give an artificial background, gives a lot of that contextual information that you're referencing. And requesting people turn on their cameras if they will. Of course, I'm not having my camera on right now, so I'm concealing that. I own that. I think that gives you far more insight. I think that typically in the past, people are dressed like you. So they're in button downs, they're in sport coats, they're in, I'm in a work dress. In COVID times, people are dressed down. They're showing their truer selves. So if you're the kind of guy who always wears a polo shirt, you're in a polo shirt. If really your comfort is a t-shirt, you're wearing a t-shirt. And your range of what you're willing to adapt to in terms of all the business formalities, so the masks that we put on, I think that there are fewer of those during COVID times. I think people are closer to their true selves at this point.
That's interesting. So we're wearing masks, but when we are on Zoom and otherwise, we are less masked, right? Because you do get to see people's, home environments and things. So it's an opportunity, because one of the advocacies we have around looking at really who your customer is and what they do is to get into their private spaces. Like you have to get into their private spaces. We would have people come into the lab and they would be perfectly dressed and, everything looked like they were together. But if you got into their house, they might be a little bit of a pack rat, right? And have a problem finding things, but the way that they presented themselves publicly. So that's interesting. So yeah, getting the camera on and then understanding where they are, right? Are you at your parents' house? They're so often like it's when people have been in such funny and interesting context. So that's good. One good way to kind of just use those visual cues. And we do have that opportunity to kind of get beyond people's barriers. What about surveying? So how many of you, that seems to always be like the lazy, easy way for companies, is they're like, oh, we'll just put together a survey and send it out and find out what the next feature or function is. What are some either positives or negatives you've seen in that, and how could you get around that in a COVID space?
Yeah, I'd say that's a good one. The surveys with like some kind of cash incentive or reward, that definitely triggers me. And then just when you're about to have that conversation, just making sure you have the key questions lined out for what intel you're looking for, I think is always a good approach. I think that's a good call, Eric.
Well, what you have to worry about, the problem with quant is a survey is a quant technique. So you have qualitative techniques, which are doing ethnography or interviewing, those types of things. And then you have quant techniques, quant techniques should confirm qualitative, and qualitative should be looking at a smoking gun that comes out of quant. So for example, if your conversion is off, that's a smoking gun out of quant. And you need to use a qualitative technique to understand the patterns and then use quant to confirm it. So it's not qual or quant, it should be both. And I'm always afraid, or I hear often where someone's like, hey, let's just bring up SurveyMonkey and let's, put together a 10 question, and they write these really poorly written questions that are, that can often be biased towards one answer or the other. And so those questions need to be informed by qualitative, and they should be confirming something that you already suspect.
Eric, I agree with you. I can't agree more. In B2C, sometimes I've thrown out a quantitative survey, but in B2B, I've never done one without the other, because it really does work hand in hand, and it's hard. It's very difficult to get people to understand why you're doing the project that way, why the money has to be budgeted for both pieces, why they have to happen in a certain way or a certain order, because that's the only way you're gonna get the whole story. But I agree with you. I've never, in B2B, you have to do them together.
Yeah, and in B2C, what's nice with qualitative will give you smoking gun, and then quantitative can confirm like numbers, like distribution of personas and things like that based on the questions. With personas that have been done well, you can typically get it down to 3 to 5 questions and put someone in their persona group just based on answering those questions. We were doing a security study, and we could ask one question and we knew which persona the person was. One question, B2C. So I've noticed some people are talking about techniques. So some other techniques you guys have talked about. Another thing that's a really good idea is a journaling activity. So having some of your either B2B or B2C customers do journaling, and you have to teach them how to do the journaling. So, if you want to understand, you need to, it's not enough to know, like my favorite example of this is back in 3rd grade. My teacher asked me to write a story about how to make a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And so it was like, okay, you get out a piece of bread, you put on the peanut butter, you put on the jelly, and you slap the two together. And she was like, no. Where did the peanut butter come from? Where did the jelly come from? And so bringing your customer and the intended person back further. So, oh, well, I had to go to the cabinet to get the bread. I had to go to the refrigerator to get the jelly. Yeah. But where did you buy the bread from? Oh, okay. So we went to the grocery store, we bought the bread, we brought it home, we put it in the cabinet. So people want to answer your question as succinctly as possible, and they want to answer it. They also want to lie, meaning that they want to be nice to you for some reason, or they don't like you for some reason. So you got to pull them back and really get them to tell you the steps prior to what they did, because that's where your product innovation is going to come from. Your product innovation doesn't come from, and I mean, maybe from a product perspective, you guys are just trying to fit a certain set of requirements, but we're always looking for like, well, what are the features that are important and where should we focus? And it's the 80-20 rule, right? So how do we pull people back and start to get them to answer the questions for us that are much earlier in the process than when our product got introduced or our service got introduced into their environment, because they didn't just decide to start using it. Like there was some reason that they kind of moved along. So that journaling activity is a really important kind of part of that concept. We're getting
we also found that quant exercises usually turn into either a sales pitch or a complete validation of the great idea that we had versus really understanding the consumer's opinion or challenge or problem.
Yeah, and so absolutely. That's great. And so Jerry said, I invite people to take a walk with me over the course of an hour in nature. You can learn a ton about folks. Yeah, that's great. That's awesome. And in today's COVID world, you could probably get away with that because it's not as, trying to get into somebody's home or if they're not at their office any longer. Understanding kind of what that impact has been to even their work style, right? Like, what does that look like? The other thing too that you have to think about, and Cortland, you were talking about the survey, simply dedicating enough time to talk to the person. So you can't, we would talk with companies and they would want us to slam in like 10 or 12 people in a day. And we knew we had to spend at least an hour to an hour and a half with someone to really get to the deep stuff. Because in the first 15 minutes or so, they're posturing, right? You haven't established any rapport with them. I interviewed Marion Nestle, who's the woman that's like the big advocate against like food companies. And it was my favorite interview ever. She hated me. Like the first 30 minutes, hated me. I went to New York University to interview her, didn't know who she was because I never research people before I go talk to them. And I think that made her mad. She's like, I'm Marion Nestle. Do you know who I am? I'm like, no idea who you are. I'm just here to interview you. And so, but then got her converted over and I got great information out of her in that last half hour. If I'd only dedicated to 15-minute to 30-minute time with her, I wouldn't have learned it. So you really have to kind of spend the time and you have to start being very curious. Just get really curious. Well, why? Well, why that? Or what did you do before that? Like, don't just wait for that answer. B2B buyers and individuals are also consumers and individuals, but they represent the priorities of a group of people focused. Yes. So yeah, Jason, you're talking about the B2B. And B2B, people think that B2B is different. Like there's some, like you show up at work and you're a different person and you're just not. And, you know, you pull some of that same kind of the way that you make decisions. Again, the decision at work is much more dangerous. I can look like an idiot. I make this choice and everybody at work is like, oh my gosh, you picked this vendor, you know? So like, how does that selection process and the decision-making criteria? So I was talking in the B2C one about how they were connected to each other, knowing that in the B2B space, like who's the decision maker and what's the influence? Like, how do you make sure that those two people are really being served? Because you want that influencer to bring to the decision maker all the things they need to make sure they're going to choose your product or to even understand it's a feature that you want to include in the roadmap moving forward.
There used to be a campaign for IBM. It was a pretty famous one that said nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. And well, that's actually not true, but it's still a great story. That being said, I think part of the illustration about that difference between the consumer buyer and the B2B buyer is if I'm a consumer and I'm making a major purchase like a car and I make a bad purchase that I'm unhappy with, I can sell the car. I'll take a little bit of loss. It's a little bit painful. If I'm a B2B buyer and I make a bad purchase of a multi-million-dollar contract, I could lose my job and the cost of that is much higher. The pain is much higher. So there's a point where I think the consumer behavior of the individual matters and then a point where it starts to matter less in the process.
Yeah. And I love that you love that example. I tell people the only person I pissed off is my spouse, right? I brought home this car and they're like, oh, why did you buy that thing, right? And the other stat that we use, a Forrester stat, is greater than 70% of the decision is made. Greater than 70% of the decision is made before the customer picks up the phone, reaches out to your company, decides to try your product for the first time. And that is a B2B stat. That is not a B2C stat. That's a Forrester research stat. And I think the number is at 80 now, but it was like 67% the last time I checked it. So, and you know that, right? Like Jason talked about the car. When I walk on the car lot, I don't walk on and go, hey, I hear you guys sell cars here. Tell me about them. Like you walk on and you go, you have this car right here and I would like to see it. And then as a salesperson, you have to be like, well, why are you interested in that car? What about that car makes you, want to look at it before you start making a decision to show me others? I'm a way more informed buyer, either on the B2B or B2C side. And when I'm bringing a product in, I showed you that B2B flow a second ago. A really important concept of this group over here in the far left, if you're a product person and you're trying to introduce something to market, sorry, far right. I don't know my left from right. I never have. Far right is that they will try your product, but if it fails them, they will get rid of it just as quickly. So their decision to use it is very quick, but their decision to stop using it is just as quick. So, and group two likes to think that they found your product and that they're the expert, even though they learned about it from somebody else. So like informing them and making them feel really like that they understand the features and that they can tell other people about it is a really important aspect of that. And then when you get into group three in the B2B space, you're sort of dragging them along. You know, this is when you're going to do an end of life on a product and say, hey, if you don't upgrade, we're not going to support you any longer. And it's going to be more expensive. Like you have to start speaking. And the word here, partner, is really important in group two. They're looking for someone to partner with them to solve a problem. And the word vendor here in group three is really important. So presenting that product or thinking about it in a different way. So words really matter, and you can't come up with the words. Your customer will give you the words, and they'll give you the words through this sort of research approach of just spending time hearing them talk about things. And the thing that drives people crazy about research is that you don't know until you know. And so you have to do a certain number of these, and they are in patterns. So you're looking at patterns of typically 6 to 8. So use your demographic breakdown. So if they tell you your customer is a, $100,000 a year household income, then interview about 8 males and 8 females in that category, but make sure you're using some deep questions, some why questions and things like that. And they will start to tell you things, and you'll start to see the patterns. You'll start to see them recognized. We used a mind mapping technology for that. And I talk about all this stuff in my book. So my book is a how to do research book. So, which means, read it before you want to go to sleep, but it is good about like, how do you actually do this and start to see the patterns? And it would become amazing. You could predict what that person was about to say based on an interview you had done before, because some of the things in their environment or the way that they presented themselves, because we all think we're really unique, but really we typically fall in 3 to 7 categories. So you notice this B2B persona set is 4 groups. There's 4 groups. So if your personas are more than 3 to 7, your context is probably too large. So we did one on cruise lines. There were 3 personas in the cruise line category. In travel, there are 5. So travel is a larger category than cruises. So cruises have 3 and travel have 5. If you told me you had 20 personas, I would be like, yeah, somebody did a bad research project. All right, let's just not how this works, because you've uncovered people who may not even be interested in that as a category. So other thoughts within, other ideas or ideas around getting to people in kind of the COVID world and finding out what they really care about in a product or service. So I would use some proxy examples. So finding out how people are concerned about other topic areas is a great way to then understand how your product might be influenced. So for example, if I'm more of a hypochondriac, like if you talk to me about, how much do I worry about either wearing a mask, not wearing a mask, what's my opinion in those categories, you start to understand something deeply about how they might even view your product. So the thing is that it's very interesting to find how those contexts sort of drive other people. That example that I gave earlier about the one question about security, we were doing a parental, it was a product that was used for parental controls of their kids. And so there was always a time when if the parent would always trust until they found out that something had happened. And if something had happened, they would typically go far to the right and become very restrictive. And so understanding, and we could use questions that weren't necessarily about the computer to get to that answer. So like, hey, has your kid ever skipped school and you found out about it, right? Or did you, they weren't where you expected them to be. And they might have been a parent who was very loose from a technology perspective at that point. But when that trust had been broken, then they're like, yeah, I put them on restriction for a month. Well, that's a parent that once they find out their kid's doing something online and it's not something that they expected or approved of, they're going to put a strong parental control in place. But we could use a proxy for another place that the trust had been broken as a way to understand that. So we didn't have to ask about online or use of computer. We just had to ask about, tell us about a time that, your child did something that, you didn't approve of, and they might give us that as an example. Well, what were your consequences? And the more strict those consequences were, the more likely they were to lock them down with parental controls versus being like, oh, kids are just kids and, that's just happens. That's somebody who may never put a parental control in place. So it's a way of using things that are not within the context to get to what you're looking at from a product perspective. So I have about 10 minutes. So any other questions?
So with 70% of the decision made before a customer contacts you, I think the pivotal question for me is, how do you move a B2B buyer to be compelled to contact you?
Educational content. You teach them. Don't tell them anything about what your product does. Teach them why it's important. And you have to understand too, so B2B, people use the words B2B and B2C, and I'll buy into that, but I use relational versus transactional. So is it a relational product? Is it a product that I need to really understand and trust? And if so, that I need more education on what it does and how it works and where it fits in my world. So that isn't always B2B. B2B is often relational. Transactional is I'm buying a t-shirt, or I got to buy a pair of shoes or something, and they're not that expensive. And so that's more of a kind of just quick conversion type thing. But if you're selling relational product, which B2B is almost always relational, be Mr. Rogers and teach me about it. Don't tell me about it. Don't tell me what it does. Don't tell me about the, and even I will use a tire store example for that. So I'm buying a set of tires. Well, you can tell me the tires you have at your store, or you can teach me about what the best tires are for my car. You can take the same content and teach me about what this thing, oh, you have this kind of car. This is the kind of tires you should have, blah, 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 blah. By the way, my store happens to sell those tires, but I'm now giving you a reason to be more educated. We're not as trusting a society specifically now. I think that's maybe the biggest thing that'll come out of kind of our COVID world. And so we want to feel confident that we've made the decision, that we've gotten the knowledge ourselves. It is, for a product manager, the job is big because it's not only here are the features and functions and how they work, but also turning that into something that's more of a lesson about how it works within their environment versus just what it does.
So Eric, are you scaling that point up to like the enterprise level, the senior business leaders, right? So definitely makes sense to me that in this environment, your comment about we're less trusting as a society makes sense, right? When you scale that up to, say, when you're selling to senior execs within large corporations, who are they going to get the trusted advice, right? I mean, we partner with a lot of these executives and have good relationships. The Seamless brand helps a lot. You see differences at that level in terms of where they go to get?
Well, it is the advocacy. So it's feeding the people that they trust that are around them the information so that they're then, so you want them to see it. So you want the senior executive to see the stuff, right? They may not be the one who consumes it, but you want that to also be shared by some of the influences that they have around them. And
Right.
then knowing the type of executive they are. So where do they fall? Are they more of an Elon Musk who's sort of a renegade who's going to like make the decision on their own versus, a relational person who cares about their network and what that looks like and participates in things like this? Or are they person being drug along, right? Like they're kind of surviving the company and trying to get it to a place. And you'll know by the company, like how well is the company sort of faring, that's going to tell you where they kind of live in that space.
Thanks.
The rule, and I mean, I guess I didn't say it, I normally do in this, is so it's used to take 7 to 10 times to establish awareness. It's 21. It's 21.
Wow, that snuck up on me. When did that happen?
It's been same kind of research that was done around
2008.
Yeah, greater than 70%. Think about the number of messages that you have coming across and how easily you can ignore them or decide that you're not gonna, or not trust or pay attention. So you need 21, and they can't all be like, it can't be the Golf Channel where you show me the same commercial 21 times. It needs to be, 21 different ways of sort of telling me about this and seeing it, and then letting me feel like I've made the decision versus being, I want to buy it, I don't want to be sold. So how do I buy it? And when I say buy, like, this sounds very sort of, someone downloading a free thing that you've created is me buying it. Me giving you my email address is me buying it. Like, I've given something in exchange for, continuing that conversation. So what are you giving me out of your product or service, or building in as a feature or function that then allows me to make that quote unquote purchase because I trust you?
We recorded this at our weekly Product Coffee virtual meetup, and I would love to have you join me and some amazing product professionals from around the world every week. If you'd like that, jump over to productcoffee.com and sign up for our newsletter. I'll send out an invitation every Monday telling you how you can log on and join us. And if you love what we're doing here, don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, hit the like button, and share it with your colleagues. Links to all the articles we talked about today are in the comments below and at the resources page at www.productcoffee.com/resources. And thanks to bensound.com for the great intro and exit music. Until next time, thanks for watching and have a great day.